So guys, in this video, we're going to be drawing this pomegranate on gray tone paper. For this drawing, you're going to need a set of graphite pencils, an eraser, a sharpening tool, and a white colored pencil. This tutorial will be the first part of a series of classes on realistic drawing on tone paper. We will start from the simple to the complex and build up our skills as we go. So the first task will be to create an envelope shape for the fruits. Using straight lines, we want to make a best guess of the overall gesture of the shape. This pomegranate is rectangular with some curves rounding it out, a reality that must be considered as you create your outline. Be wary of overthinking your marks at this stage. You want to trust your eyes and draw what you see before using a divider or anything else to cross-check your accuracy. You have to have something on paper first before you can judge whether or not it is exact. At this point, I can begin to define the smaller shapes within the fruits, beginning with the calyx of the pomegranate, which is circular overall, but with some straight lines, creating key angle breaks. Use as few lines as possible, generally somewhere between 7 to 9, to define this shape and ignore any details that you see. The same advice applies to the shadow being cast by the calyx. The form shadow on the fruit is downward sloping. It's also irregular in the pattern it creates along the bedrock line. Also, pay attention to the fact that this pomegranate is about 1/3 shadow and 2/3 light, so we don't want to exaggerate the size of the shadow shape, else it's going to look inaccurate. As I'm sketching in the bedrock line, my goal is not to mimic exactly what I see in my reference, but to capture the essence of the pattern to create something that looks natural. The key to that natural aesthetic is irregularity in the shapes and contours. If you find that you're struggling with this part, you might want to try and copy the reference exactly, because our instincts as human beings is to create repeating patterns. We're now approaching the end of this stage, so feel free to erase any construction lines, add the smaller shapes in the calyx, and make any other tweaks to the drawing that will better set you up for the value blocking. At this stage, we will be mapping out the larger forms of the fruits, creating our shadow and light values without fully expressing the entire value scale. Starting in the shadow, we want to create one even tone across the board. Use a B or a 2B pencil preferably, and be consistent with the direction of the marks you make. How you apply the tone affects how the tone looks, so fight the urge to zigzag or push hard with your pencil on the paper. Hold the pencil closest to its edge and draw with your arm more so than your wrist. Eventually, we will add more variation with the shadows, but for now, we don't need them. For the cast shadow, think of it as an incomplete ellipse. You don't want to make it too round like a circle, or too elongated either. Once you draw that out, build up the value in the shape to match the rest of the shadows in the form of the fruit. If you want, you can cross hatch like I'm doing here. As long as there's consistency to the hatching, the results will be just fine. You can break the foam shadow into two basic parts, a core shadow and an area of reflected light. The core shadow is the part of the shadow where light is the most occluded or absent, and consequently it is the darkest part of the foam shadow. It does not benefit from direct light or reflected light for that matter. Start defining the core shadow with your 2B and 4B pencils, layering them one step at a time, and gradually building up your value to near full saturation. The next step will be to use your HB and H pencils to create half tones around the bedrock line, aka the point at which shadow meets light. Build up those values one layer at a time and keep the variations in the values to a minimum. Because we are drawing on tone paper, the value of the paper will be the bridge between the half tones we create now and the lights we will create with that white pencil later on. Now it's time to pull out your white colored pencil to create the highlights. We waited till the end to do this because the highlight is not really a part of the form of the pomegranate, but it's still an important element nonetheless. Think of it as icing on the cake. Icing is great, but useless if the cake sucks. Using our reference photo as a guide, we will start with the brightest part of the highlight and move outwards from that center with slightly darker versions of it. The highlight must be given the same attention as any other parts of the drawing. Layer carefully, soften the edges between the values with controlled pressure, and create the soft but specific shapes that you see. We're going to be making marks with the end result fully in mind. Beginning in the shadows, we're going to establish the lower limits of our value scale and develop the tones to their maximum darkness. I will start with the core shadow because it's the darkest part of the shadow and patiently build it up one layer at a time until I'm happy with both the surface area it covers and the value. If you'll notice, I'm consistent with the direction of my pencil strokes and I'm not jumping around all over the picture. Another thing to keep in mind is that pencils, especially the darker ones, get blunt really fast. So you want to develop the habit of constantly sharpening them so you can get even tone. Along those lines, your kneaded eraser is your best friend. Use it to pick out the inconsistencies in the tone and go over those areas with your lighter pencil if it got too light. The same methodology applies with the reflected light. Start with building up your values in the darkest areas and move outwards to the parts catching more light. A common mistake here is to make the reflected light too bright, as though it is a part of the light family. The lightest part of the shadow, i.e. the reflected light, still needs to be darker than any value in the light family. The second most common mistake is to create hard edges between the core shadow and the reflected light. They should blend seamlessly and emerge optically when you squint your eyes. So, make the effort to blend the edges not by smudging, but by shading the appropriate intermediate value between the two. In the shadow cast by the calyx, we have the occlusion shadow and the cast shadow. The pyrite light is the most occluded, and the rest of it probably might be getting some bounce light. The specific names don't matter too much. What we care about is that there is a darker section and lighter section, and the values here should be in harmony with the values we have hitherto established. So, make sure that as you work, you dart your eyes back to the form shadow and make any necessary adjustments. With our shadows firmly established, what remains is to give life to the lights in our picture. We will start at the bedbug line using our HB and B pencils, primarily to gradate the value from shadow to halftone. As always, be consistent with the marks that you make. You can crosshatch, hatch, stipple, whatever, just don't make marks that are all over the place. In the reference, you can see this band of value growing across the fruit representing the darkest halftones. This is our primary focus, approximating the shape, values, and the edges surrounding it. As you're just focusing on getting the shape right, then the value, and finally the edges. Breaking it down this way will allow your brain to process the information more easily and hopefully lead to a better result. For the shape, all that matters is that you come close to what you see in your reference, and you remember that this is a value shape, so it should be soft and not easily identifiable. This is realism after all, and when you see pomegranate in real life, you're not going to see the shapes in the part of the form with hard edges. As for the values in this section, they can only be correct in relation to what is already present. So, given that the halftones are in the light family, we cannot allow them to get darker than our existing shadows. And this is just going to take practice. You have to routinely check back in with your shadows as your halftones darken to make sure you're not encroaching on that territory. Now, this is a rule of thumb and something we should follow. However, there are exceptions to the rule, and even in this reference image, there are parts of the reflected light that are actually lighter than our darkest halftones. For the sake of simplicity and to avoid confusion, keep the light and shadow values separate from each other. Moving on to the edges, the ones we have where light meets shadow are on the whole soft and in some areas lost. No hard edges in sight. This is because the degree of turn or the curvature of the fruit as it moves from shadow to light is gradual, as opposed to the sharp change in direction you would have in a staircase or the example I have on screen. The sharper the change in angle relative to the light source, the more likely you are to have a hard edge.